income in rural areas is on silver houses, then how much is that costing in these rural areas? Does it actually mean that people in rural areas are paying a lot of money for silver houses because their disposable income, the next highest of it is on housing? So why is the quality of housing there not to par? But the disturbing one, again speaking to the relevance of strengthening the agriculture sector, is this 60% that is spent on food. So basically, rural households are just surviving. The money they get is to get food. Quite problematic when you're thinking about enablers for economic development. We can talk about skills, but you cannot go to a class with an empty stomach. And then, again, this is another justification for the agriculture sector, right? For strengthening it, which is actually the majority of the income. That little income that we saw is coming from that sector. And that's what the numbers are showing, that that sector, if developed, indeed, it might make a dent in the economic development in rural areas, because that's where the majority of the income is coming from. I see the minister from Lyric is here, Madam Ntoivu. We are working, and my brothers and sisters from Bonn, we are working on the Global Accelerator. So it's about jobs. And I was sharing with Madam Ntoivu that giving the UN the task to think about this is we were not actually thinking strongly about the rural economy as a part of the Global Accelerator. And this is, again, very telling, which is we were talking about informality and employment, Namibia. And that's the thing about data that we are talking about. When we even ask, when we say that unemployment rate in Namibia is 33%, we haven't been disaggregating that data, right? So we looked at it as a whole. But when you disaggregate, then you realize that there has to be need to target the rural areas, and perhaps if we do target the rural areas, that's where we're going to start seeing changes in the inequality, in the unemployment, and in the poverty rates. Again, the point of informality, and this discrepancy is even so much higher. We have been talking about informality and we think capita, right? But maybe we need to think even further and find out where these discrepancies in informality, what it tells us and where our focus really needs to be. And then, of course, the labor force participation. We learned from my colleague from INO about the labor, sort of the nature of the labor force in the agriculture sector in the rural areas, and the issues around that. So this discrepancy is not that big, but again, the devil is in the details, which is if the majority are employed in agriculture, what is going on in that sector when it comes to their rights? And this was a bit disturbing, because in the UN we have this principle called leaving no one behind. So we are leaving rural people behind, but we are leaving the most vulnerable even behind. We see that these households are being headed by children. They are being headed by persons with disabilities, by the elderly. So it is a complex picture. It's not just about now saying rural areas, it's asking who in the rural areas. So we then were asked to talk a little bit about the decentralization policy. We think that devolution supports sort of the delivery of services. The closer you are to the people, the more you understand them, the more you know them, and hopefully the more you can provide them with the services. So we learned about the decentralization policy, and then we read a little bit about the status of that policy. And the verdict, unfortunately, is that perhaps we have not really utilized that policy to the extent to which it is supposed to be utilized, and as such, maybe we have not optimized outcomes from it. And so, if the services are not closer to the people, then we are not doing our part in sort of advancing economic development. And unfortunately, the outcomes paint that picture. For example, the technology numbers, right? You can see again, rural, urban, the differences in who owns a phone, who owns a smartphone, who owns a computer, right? So when we kind of, again, service delivery is a part of governance, right? So if we are not closer to the people, these are some of the outcomes that come up. There's this difference in people who own phones and those who don't within the urban and the rural. The education is also disproportionate, right? And these are some of the enablers for economic development, some of the inputs, right? So again, when we are not close to the people, these are some of the results that we get. And then the spatial differences. Again, the silver houses. You can see, again, in housing, we saw that a lot of the food and housing is where majority of the funds or the income for rural areas go. But the quality of housing is a problem. So it's sort of a catch-22. You're spending a lot of your money on housing, but then you don't even get good quality housing. And housing is a human right, by the way. And then the energy shortage. I think we had a lot about electricity accessibility. The numbers, again, also showed. I mean, agriculture, now we're talking about it, smart agriculture and modernization. It's not just about holes, right? So you need energy for irrigation, you need energy for motoring your tools. So even if we are going to promote agriculture in the rural areas, they're going to need the energy to make that modern. Healthcare access. Again, you can be trained in skills, but if you're not a healthy person, that development intervention is not sustainable. Our resources will be used by the government to educate you, and if you're ill and you're not there anymore, that's sort of a waste of resource. So healthcare contributes to human capital, just like education. And then there's some words we are interchanging, and which was also a moment of reflection for us. There's economic development, and then there's rural transformation. So we think that we have talked a lot about economic development in its various facets. And to advance a bit the agenda on economic development in rural areas, we need rural transformation. So it's not rural economic development, but it's rural transformation. And rightly so, right? The topic of the symposium today. So the goal, well, our recommendation is when we leave the room, is we think more about rural transformation instead of rural economic development. Because rural transformation then allows us to develop a strategy of intervention. You can see the definition. It's basically a change where rural societies diversify their economies, reduce reliance on agriculture, become dependent on trade and goods, and basically it's a process of structural transformation. It's looking at the rural sector in a manner that sort of enables economic transformation. And the point was made about different regions have different comparative advantages. That's also in this slide. So you look beyond agriculture and you ask yourself, what does what you're going to have to offer as a comparative advantage, right? Maybe not agriculture, maybe agriculture. What does the rural have to offer, right? So that's how you start thinking in rural transformation. you think about economic diversification, which is another concept that we are advancing in Namibia, which is how can we diversify the economy? So the concept of rural transformation allows us to think about economic diversification and also to leverage the comparative advantages of the different areas. And of course, this was saying the agri-food sector, the local drivers moving away from agriculture, thinking beyond agriculture, and then about the larger value chain for the rural areas. And I think innately we are used to here in rural areas and here in agriculture. But maybe in rural areas have other economic activities that they can contribute. Of course, it's the when we have the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is sort of where we anchor the support, which is the Agenda on Rural Transformation contributes to this range of SDGs 1, 2, 4, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, and 17. But more importantly, the Agenda for Rural Transformation is also anchored in the AU's Agenda 2063 of the African Fund. There is the CARA, which is the Comprehensive Agriculture Development Program for Africa. The beauty of CARA is that it actually has governance principles enshrined into it, right? Talks about African ownership and leadership, accountability and transparency and inclusiveness, evidence-based planning and decision-making, the regional complementarities, right? If we advance the agriculture sector in Namibia, say livestock, Namibia probably won't be able to pursue all of those projects. May need to export some to Ghana, right? So you need to have a regional perspective when it comes to the agriculture sector, because maybe you have a surplus and maybe there's a demand continentally for those agricultural products. So again, this whole point of extending the thinking and the conversation. So as we think about the support of the UN, we also think about the value added of the thinking that's happening in the African Union. And the other story is actually African Union and AU, their similarities in what we are trying to advocate. So we complement each other. So these are the questions we were asked to ponder. Who should participate in the design of policies for rural economic development? The role of monitoring and evaluation, and then administrative capacity and technical assistance. So data, the decentralization policy, and the design. First, we wanted to talk about the opportunities. We still think the decentralization policy is an opportunity, and it's good that it's going to be reviewed. But it should be reviewed with economic transformation and structured transformation in mind. So bring economic development into the decentralization policy. And then this point was made earlier about the differences within the different regions. Again, given how vast Namibia is, within the UN we have this concept called area-based programming. So it's similar to the concept that Dr. Hayama mentioned about South Korea, the village. So given the vastness of the country, there's value in thinking about specific areas and then deciding on what the intervention should be for them. This point of natural resources governance, for us, for Namibia, is an important one. Agriculture will be dependent on natural resources, whether it's land, whether it's whatever it is. So we think that in that rural sort of development strategy, maybe also think about a natural resources governance strategy, right? So that it's not just about economics, but those frameworks that Dr. Ajambo talked about, but they narrow down to the resources aspect of it. The enablers, technology, entrepreneurship, research and development are all opportunities. And more importantly, within our work, we have this concept called a human rights-based economy. We find that when we dwell only and mostly on economics, we are leaving people behind. But when we think about economic sort of organization from a human rights perspective, and we saw already people in rural areas are left behind, then perhaps that can guide our thinking on strengthening or further developing the rural sector.